All right. So I want to welcome Jason King to the podcast. He's very graciously made some time and more than once been willing to set aside time. So now we're finally getting to meet. It's great to have you here, Jason. Um, Thanks again. And could you just start by telling us a little bit about how you came across Philip Pullman, how you got interested in his work, how it connects with your work at St. Vincent College?
Good. Yeah. I was in graduate school, and the time during graduate school, this is when the Harry Potter stuff was sort of hitting. And so I was desperately looking for something fun to read and was hitting the Harry Potter stuff as they came along. But as I read this, I also ran into a review that said, oh, if you like Harry Potter, you should also try these other series. And I looked it up, and one was this Philip Pullman's Golden Compass. And the review said it's sort of like a Paradise Lost inverted. And I was like, oh, I just got to do that. My degree's in theology. I'm like, this is going to be a total sort of blast. And so I read it a little bit, and then I gave it to friends of mine. I gave it to the woman who's now my wife. I tried to give it to Donna Freitas, who and I worked together. And she's like, I've already read that book. And so then we started spending a lot of time just talking about it. Partly it was to get through graduate school as sort of fellowship, but then as we talked, it just became so much interesting. There's just so many layers of things that were sort of going on, and I just ended up in a really interesting place, sort of thinking about sort of Pullman and his sort of anti-Narnia, anti-Christianity that I want to argue that is really pretty thoroughly sort of Christian. So it's this sort of funny place that we sort of arrived at. So Donna and I worked, and we wrote a book together. That's really where it sort of came out of. But that sort of interest in culture and science fiction has continued to sort of influence my work. It's important to me as a person. And I was looking as a way in which I connected to students, and eventually a lot of my students, I built up all these relationships with students that liked science fiction, fantasy, superheroes. And so most recently it started to connect up because I teach this course at St. Vincent's called Aliens, Monsters, Heroes, and Jesus. And so I do a bunch of science fiction, fantasy, superhero kinds of things. And Philip Pullman will sometimes sort of make an appearance in that course as I mix up the sort of text in that as well. So it started out really purely of just personal interest, enjoying it,
Mhm.
moved into a friendship of things that I like to share. And then my intellectual life sort of kicked in, and that's sort of where it went. Yeah.
Excellent. So you've actually taught this series, or do you teach just one of the books?
I just taught the first one. The series is so big
Yeah.
and that I am hoping that they like get enamored with the first book, and that sort of take them out for sort of the rest of them. So,
Right on. Yeah. Well, I've read your book, Killing the Imposter God,
yeah.
Philip Pullman's Spiritual Imagination, right, is the subtitle. And so you co-wrote that. I liked it. I thought it was really interesting. Of things that I've read about Pullman, I think it takes a really interesting angle on a discussion that can get kind of well worn a bit. Like you mentioned the Narnia comparisons. I think you guys did a really interesting job of treating his approach to theology and storytelling, and how that's kind of crystallized in dust. To back up a little bit, I'm kind of interested in how the writing of that book worked, because you co-wrote it, as you said, with Donna Freitas, and she's I guess a collaborator with you on a few other books too, right?
Yeah.
What's your process like when you write together with her?
That's a good question. Yeah. Her and I were in graduate school together, coming from sort of different places, and just sort of struck up a kind of friendship over a bunch of different sort of topics. We originally collaborated beforehand. She was dating a person. I was dating Kelly, is my wife now. And we were talking about theology. We realized there was not a theology of dating. So we wrote a paper on dating. It got picked up. We wrote a book on it. And then Donna went on and wrote a book on Bridget Jones and spirituality. And then she's like, I got an idea. We should do the Pullman book. And so the Pullman book we came back to sort of did together. And so periodically we sort of come back and forth. We have our sort of own trajectories, but it's really sort of built in a kind of friendship. The writing process is pretty, I actually really enjoy it. It's a little bit easier. I don't know how you would do it without technology and the internet, because we could send email files back and forth pretty easily. But what you do is, what we did is, like, you would start to draft we'd sort of divide up, we'd sit and talk and sort of map out like the overarching sort of structure of the book and the main arguments, the general arguments, because as we get into details, a lot of times they get refined. And all right, we'll say, I'll do this chapter, you'll start this chapter. But you'd write a chapter and you'd realize like, I don't have to say everything here. And I can sort of get about like 3/4 of the way done, and then I like send it off to her. And she's like, oh, let's change this, let's do that, let's move this piece over here. And then she'd do a stab at it, and then she'd usually send it back to me. And then I'd sort of, oh, that's sort of good and brilliant, and sort of smooth it over there as well. It helps to be good friends, because you can be like, say like, oh, that's not working. And that's like, okay, that's good. So we have a good working relationship going back and forth in that. So each of the chapters is like, I don't know, like 5/8 one of ours, and then the rest of it is like through the process of revision, sort of back and forth, and that sort of iterations on it. We developed a pretty good style on that. Again, it just helps if you love the subject and you just want to really sort of talk about it. But yeah, so I guess that's it. And then we had a big argument for actually with the title of the Pullman book. We sort of worked at it for a long time, and it was this sort of moment when we were like sort of trying to like he's saying all of these things that sort of seem like anti-Christian, but it's all the things, a lot of things that we sort of agree with, and we're Christians. What do we do with this? How do we pitch it as a fight? And then I just remember Donna calling me up one day. She's like, I got it. He's like an anonymous Christian. And so that sort of helped us sort of like halfway through sort of refocus the book and sort of get our main arguments sort of together. So yeah, so journeying out, sort of know where you're going, but not quite. You don't have to like have everything mapped out at the beginning.
Yeah, well, it strikes me that that's similar in some ways to how Pullman talks about his work as a writer. He doesn't necessarily have the entire thing figured out when he sits down to write, but he does, sort of do as much as he can. He's sort of very disciplined about writing something, even if he doesn't know quite where it's going. And then sort of trusting in the story itself, kind of emerging as he goes through this work. And he talks in a little bit of a similar way about having a kind of voice, that he's working along with. He's collaborating with this narrator, right? In his writing, he tends to use this kind of old-fashioned omniscient narrator who knows things that are going on inside of characters, but also things that are going on generally, is sort of judgmental at times, but at times coy, so it's a very interesting, it's not easy to say exactly where the narrator ends and Pullman begins, or vice versa, if you see what I mean. And so I'm curious, I think the first question I'd like to ask, like as far as specifics go, I think in broad strokes, I sort of agree with your argument, but I'm curious what you think about the question of what Pullman's own stance towards religion, how that is conveyed through the story that he's telling, that his sort of narrator demonic persona is telling. Where is the point of connection between Pullman as a person in the world, his religious stance, and that of the narrator, the story seemingly sort of conjuring up something about religion? If that makes sense. How do those connect? Where do they diverge? What do you think about that issue?
Yeah, that's a good one. Because I started in on the Golden Compass without really knowing much about Pullman at all, other than the sort of like, the little blurb sort of begin with, and taken pretty quickly into his world, and the like quasi steampunk, the daemons, the whole bunch of different things in there. I was just totally sort of taken with, and it wasn't like till halfway through that I was starting to pick up like, the authority, the church has this kind of peculiar role in it. And so that was one of those moments I was like, this is sort of interesting. And that, I think part of that is that ongoing critique of how institutions wrapped in a kind of religious mythology can then use that as a way to really marginalize and harm people. And I saw him like playing out that sort of critique of not just institutions, because they got their own sort of limitations, but when it's wrapped up in this kind of religious aspect, how it sort of shields them from being revised or critiqued or sort of checking them in their sort of power. And that's what one of the themes that I resonated with. but also like that started to get me his sense of understanding of sort of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then, and a counterpose to that, the kind of compassion and mercy that the sort of his main characters sort of have on the other side. So I was like really, so that it wasn't, I was like sort of, I guess 2/3 through the subtle knife and into the amber spyglass when I was starting to dig back into sort of his own personal life. And that was sort of my sense. I got like his main thrust about religion was the way in which those religious institutions can harm people with those sort of that religious sort of background. So then I don't know quite how those two things put together, like his personal view. I really felt like, especially that first story, like he was just driving at this kind of issue with Lyra and playing in this fantasy world that I thought was sort of really sort of gripping. And I felt like as he was putting those pieces together, some of those beliefs that he had started to shape that sort of fantasy sort of narrative. I really see him in some ways like parallel to like the way that Tolkien describes this sort of fantasy world. Tolkien calls it, I think, like co-creation. Like there's a kind of a world behind here that he's got all these values and principles, and those aren't directly mediated into the story, but they inform the way the story is sort of shaped and told. And that was sort of the way I started to think about Pullman, is that he clearly has all of these beliefs and stuff that shape his own personal horizon, but that's the context within which he's creating this world. So I didn't quite catch his I never felt like he was like trying to push a kind of agenda from his beliefs into the books. I felt like he's got this view about good and bad, right and wrong that's in the background. And then as he's telling the story, that's clearly sort of informing the kind of fantasy that sort of comes about. So I do see a kind of a distance at that a little bit. So I guess I see him much more like Tolkien than I see him like Lewis, that tends to have a little bit more allegory in it. So
that's very interesting. I think I would agree with that. And as much as he's compared to Lewis, because he sort of invites that, right, by positioning himself as this strong atheist apologist in effect, right, or rather the attacker of apologists for Christianity, he's actually a lot more like Tolkien in some ways as a storyteller. I think so. He actually has some really interesting biographical parallels with Tolkien too, in terms of like his youth in Africa, right? They have that in common. He loses his father early. So there's some weird, and of course the Oxford thing, which is very, very strong.
Like fantasy surrounding Oxford, I feel like sometimes like, seems to give birth to so much.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think in terms of the personal religious attitudes, he does. I think I would agree that they are much less noticeable in the first book. They become more forcefully pushed as you go through, and then you can sort of read back into earlier parts of the story and see them a lot more clearly, in more sort of metaphorical ways, right, and less overt ways. But I think I agree that he overstates things in his actual correspondence and stuff in the real world. I think for me it's a way of him getting people to read his books, probably, to generate controversy, to get his name allied with these other names which people are very passionate about, and so they're gonna see what he's saying about that in his stories. But I think the stories are quite Christian, actually, in a weird way. And I think you guys lay out that argument pretty well. So could you just kind of walk through a little bit of the ways in which you see a kind of Christianity implicit in the stories themselves?
Yeah. I mean, I always joke when I sort of taught this book, I'm like, this is the atheist that doesn't believe in God, but the only thing that can save us is self-sacrificing love with the help of grace. So, and so I always sort of find this sort of interesting. I think he's got, I think like he's got this idea of the idea of God that he's critiquing is that sort of God that's sort of separate, that almost the deistic kind of God separate from us. And yet he has this idea of dust that's sort of intimately connected to us, that's responds to us, is sort of responsible for our consciousness. And so it's a almost like a pantheistic sort of notion of God. That's this part of our argument, that there's this understanding of God that's intimately involved with us. And so I think that's the first piece of it. And it's because now Tolkien's on my mind, like that Tolkien's understanding of his gods has that same kind of this worldly kind of connection to this as well. But I think the dust for him has that kind of sort of capacity to it that seems to not be so independent from us, but also tends to move us to things that are good and loving and sort of helpful in those sort of pieces. And then so that's one piece. The second piece is that I think what you find in response to all of the authority and the church that runs through all of the worlds and all of the sort of books is these moments of sacrificial love that saves people, and it goes from like Lyra at the end and her separation from Pan. It goes from Lee Scoresby sort of in the first one, like all of these characters willing to give up their status and their power to sort of help make things sort of better. Mm-hmm. I think the third piece of that too is that he finds it's the voices on the fringes are the ones that seem to sort of speak up. So it's the young girl, it's the disinherited bear, it's the witches, it's the gypsies, it's the all of these sort of fringe characters from the margins. And at least for me, and like from Christianity, right? Like this is Jesus who comes into his hometown and nobody, this is the carpenter's son, this is the guy from Nazareth, this is nobody sort of important or significant. He recruits not the powerful, he recruits the fishermen and the women. And so there's a variety of ways in which I think that sort of ministry comes from the side, and it's from those margins that you start to see people that aren't concerned with their climbing up the ladder, but are concerned with love and care and making things sort of better. And then this then brings you sort of more in line with dust or God, and that the dust then also is that grace that starts to help you out, gives you abilities. And the clearest one, right, is the golden compass at the beginning. Lyra has this ability to read the golden compass that transcends any sort of knowledge that sort of helps her out. So I see him having this sort of vision that basically the principle of operation for the whole world is kind of sacrificial love. And it comes mainly from the people that are not in power oppressing, but from the margins that are sort of seeking to think things are sort of better. And then you have this sort of force that connects us all together, which is a kind of a pantheistic sort of notion of God. So
yeah, totally. And so I'm interested then in sort of putting yourself or placing yourself in that kind of mental framework. How could we imagine his institution going so astray? Why is it that the church then is this oppressive, very patriarchal institution, which doesn't seem to reflect all of those elements of the gospel story, the kind of lived experience of people who have, felt grace or something like that, or committed an act of self-sacrifice or anything like that? Where does that diverge so much from the institution in his world, potentially in our world, that he seems to be really critiquing that component, that dogmatic, oppressive aspect of religion?
Good. That's a great question. I'm going to go at this sort of back end. There was a comment, I'm trying to remember the context within Pullman made it, but they asked him like, what are the best books of all time or something? And he's like, I don't want to play that game. I would rather get a bunch of people saying like, where's some books you should read? Like, not like he's very averse to like ranking things and setting up kind of hierarchies. And he really just is like, public libraries, like, let's read a whole bunch of books. Let's have a great read where everybody's sort of reading everything. And I feel like I like that comment because I feel like for him, this is where the problem starts to come in. And so I think when you get to the golden compass in the subtle knife and amber spyglass, for him, right, it is the idea of the authority and then the Metatron who sort of carries them out, and that to try to secure their position, that they work to sort of implement all of this stuff sort of top down. And so they're able to bring certain people on board that are willing to, for their own power and their own position, willing to sort of put themselves subordinate to those above them, but then it's because they'll get power over people sort of below them. And that starts to build out from really the top in his sort of spiritual world, down through sort of the church, and then down through all of the people that you start to run into in the stories. And so everybody's willing to sort of, those on the church are, or in Pullman's world, are willing to play this game of getting positions of status and importance and value by subordinating themselves to someone higher, so they can get, I feel like it's like almost like an Amway sort of scheme or something like that, or a pyramid scheme. That's really not an Amway, but like a Ponzi scheme. And that they become really then highly invested in preserving that order and that structure, and then really penalize people that step out of it, because that's a kind of a threat. So you're looking to keep on, especially the further down you go, to keep pressure on people to conform. And I feel like that's where he sees it, I think, in the world. And when I start to step out of that world, those are the things that I see really important. One is C.S. Lewis had a wonderful essay called The Inner Circle. I don't know. And it's a nonfiction essay. And it's called, he talks about like how there's a dynamic in human beings where we're always trying to get into the inner circle. And you never know if you're in the inner circle, but there's always this sort of secret desire. Oh, if you know this or know that, or know this kind of thing, then you're in the inner circle. And his point was basically like, there's always another inner circle, and and the whole point of these circles is to exclude other people. And so there's that sort of sense of trying to get higher and belonging and sort of more important. And Lewis contrasted this with Christianity, saying this is not what this is about. You've lost something. And Lewis even says like you can use Christianity in ways that are really toxic by making Christianity part of an inner circle. And part of I think Lewis's mere Christianity was a kind of rejection of that notion of Christianity to advance you along, and it's just sort of be mere Christianity. So I think like when I see Pullman's critique he's really fascinating in the world that he's got, but even outside is a pretty powerful critique about how religion can go wrong. And I see this. I see this in a bunch of places. I'm in Southwest Pennsylvania, so we're recovering from the Attorney General's report on the sex abuse crisis. So you see like our current bishop, I think, is very good, but you see like in past iterations where people sort of tried to preserve their dignity instead of like owning up to sort of what's going on. But it's not just the church. I see it, you see it in like little city governments or amongst faculty members of colleges where you get, people trying to like, instead of like doing what's right, like trying to hold on to power and trying to secure their sort of position. So I think there's a kind of a real danger. I think it's sort of a common human dynamic, but then it also gets picked up when it gets exacerbated in hierarchical schemes, and then bigger hierarchical schemes make it worse. And then if you add the religious trappings on it, that can be used as a way to even further sort of secure this. Because it's not just you disagree, then you become a dissident, and then you become a sort of heretic, and that sort of moves you out of this sort of realm that's there. So I think that I think it's a real powerful sort of critique. And I mean, this is why I think Pullman is sort of like a closet Christian too, because this is partly Jesus's critique, right? Like these people that are interested in paying taxes on, dill and mint, but not neglecting justice and mercy. And he's, people that worried about the length of their tassels as opposed to sort of kindness and sort of forgiveness. And so I think there is that real danger there that human dynamic can be built up in hierarchies, and then with a religious overlay becomes really difficult to sort of change. So I think that's it. Or like that's my sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah. It's a really, I think, as you put it, a really prevalent issue these days, right? Is sort of questioning authority, questioning hierarchical structures because of those corruptions which are sort of built into human nature and thus into any formation that we try to put ourselves in. I think it goes back to his concern with the fall as kind of the fundamental story that he's interested in, right? Because there's a lot of different ways to read that story, but one way to read it is as Adam and Eve wanting to go above their allotted station, right?
Yeah.
And hold on to or gain even some power that they're not supposed to really have, and want to kind of see the world as God sees it or something like that, rather than as he has intended and created them to experience the world, right? And I think Pullman has a really interesting read of that story, which is not that really, but maybe that's sort of a component of what he sees the church doing instead, right? As this kind of awful corruption and machine sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a
So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
no. That was just that's a good way to describe it. Yeah, it's like the machine that starts to eat you up, and it's sort of inevitably grinding you out, and it's really hard to sort of stop, and it's got all the parts that are unflexible and sort of move. Yeah, that was just a good word for it, I thought. So
Yeah, well, yeah. So I'm interested, I guess, in you mentioned pantheism, or I think you even talk about panentheism as a
yeah,
kind of development of that idea. That's a big component of your read of Pullman's Christianity, so to speak. There's
yeah,
also this thread of liberation theology, which
yeah.
picks up on some of those elements you were talking about. Could you expand a bit on those, but also maybe in the light of this fundamental story about human nature, how those things can kind of help us uh, balance better those desires for power with more sort of humanistic or compassionate impulses that are in us.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. Yeah, it's a. I gotta go at this sort of backwards because I was thinking like there is this the human nature, right? It has it's got a desire to love. That's I think pretty sort of deep into that, and then that gets skewed. I sometimes right for this sense of status or belonging or importance or meaning because that there's a sense of like you want to be valued, you want to be loved, you want to have purpose, and it's not just to be loved. We also want to love others. So it seems to be that's a pretty fundamental sort of human dynamic. And we part of that is we want to belong to communities, and so there is this tension, maybe not a tension, but there is an impulse in us to belong to communities and look to people that are that can be leaders. And I just remember at the very end of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone when Harry had defeated Voldemort or that time around and they were coming back in, but Slytherin had won the House Cup. And Dumbledore came in as like, oh, but we have a few extra points and waved a wand and like everything was fixed. And I just remember at that point thinking like, oh, that's a guy that you want in charge. Like that's the kind of leader that you want. And then you have these, like in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, you have those sort of moments of, Aragorn or Gandalf, like leaders that know how to lead, not by tyranny or force, but by bringing out the best in sort of people. And so I feel like Pullman has a little bit of that sort of too, because you've got Lyra who's sort of trusted and Lee Scoresby and Yorick, like all of those kind of, and Will Perry, like all these kind of characters that people follow because they know that they're sort of up for sort of good. So that's a sort of a long-winded way. When you get into like liberation theology, one of the things that liberation theology does is it does a few things. One, it starts with people's experiences of being pushed to the sides, and it sort of helps us to ask that question about why are we sort of pushed to the sides and what does this sort of do to us? And I think when you've got that human nature of wanting to belong, wanting to be part of community, wanting to contribute, wanting to love and sort of to be loved, when you're pushed to the sides, all of those things are hindered and are frustrated. And so then why do you go to those marginal voices? Because you see where things aren't working well, where human beings are suffering. And then you sort of ask the question, why? What's going on? And liberation theology's main move is like there are structures in place that actually hinder this fulfillment. And so how can we start to think, analyze the structures, change the structures such that it's easier for us to reach those kinds of fulfillment. They draw a little bit of that sort of dynamics, the economic sort of analysis that money helps you to do things. And I teach a class called God, Work, and Money. And I'm like, the problem with money is that it's really, really important. And you have to pay attention to it. And but it's because it's so important that it can start to rival God. And I think that this is part of those structural analysis from liberation theology is that the people in power have so much vested in keeping things the way that they are. And so their ability to change that is sort of limited. And especially if they're not in solidarity with those on the fringes, then they don't have that empathy that is the foundation of the desire to sort of change those things. So part of liberation theology is look at those voices at the margins, see those structures that are helping them out, be in solidarity with them, and take their perspective in order that they might flourish. And I think the best of liberation theology is that you do this not just to sort of help the poor, you do this because it actually helps you if you're in power and position. Like the whole world's better when these structures are sort of are improved. And so like you might be in power in this sort of system, but you're also subordinated to someone else in this sort of system as well. And so that's when we did that, when we started to think about Pullman as a Christian, that seemed to be the sort of natural fit. Like you've got this church structure or this hierarchical church structure in Pullman's sort of fantasy world, but it seems to be terrible for everybody that's in it, right? Even the authority at the end, right, is trapped in his own like little like crystal sort of cage, and Metatron's, it's taken over these kinds of things. And then there's a sort of ranking of everybody that seems, and if you're lower down, you're sort of more oppressed. And then it's these sort of people at the margins that sort of see what's going on and can actually sort of then mobilize because they have friendships and relationships connected to them that can then sort of push back on it. So they can have, I know Pullman probably wouldn't use these words, but like legitimate authority, like they can speak voices and create communities in ways that are life-giving as opposed to as kind of oppressive structures that are there. So I think that the marginal voices, that deep-seated need to belong and to sort of fit in, and that critique of institutional or structures that hinder our human sort of flourishing. So,
yeah. I think he's ambivalent about authority in a way, because he does talk about people having a kind of natural authority that is recognized by audiences or by other characters, and I think he as an author has this kind of weird paradox where he is completely in charge of the story, right? But on the other hand, as readers, we are completely in charge of how we interpret and sort of act upon whatever we learn from the story. So I think he wants to have sort of both of those be in play. And yeah, it's very interesting how he has this very dramatic, death of God scene. But it's the way that it's portrayed is weirdly, moving and weirdly anticlimactic. It's a form which is mirrored by the escape from death, right? As the dead ghosts come out, they dissipate in much the same way as the old angelic figure of the authority dissipate, right? And this leads us into dust, right? So what you have left is kind of this dark matter, this particle of possibilities. What is dust, and how does it take the place of or rename God for Pullman?
Because so when we were trying to think about that, right, dust has this it makes up sort of part of everything. It's sort of the source of consciousness. It's the source of sort of evolution. It's the things that connect us to sort of one another. It also seems to have its own right, like trajectory about sort of what's good and what's not good, and so it has this kind of I don't know what you would call it, like the structure of the universe, I think, sort of written into that, a current of sort of the universe. And so I see those sort of pieces in this. And this is, you made a good point earlier I wanted to sort of come back to, because I mentioned it like as pantheism, and pantheism sort of conflates the world and God, and panentheism wants to make a little bit of a distinction sort of between those things. And I think that's what we argued in the book, that's probably closer a little bit to Pullman, that he wants to make it sort of a distinction that it's not just like people are dust and that's sort of what it is, but there is this sort of sense of identity, but it's intimately connected to this other kind of entity. Now, I think one of the things that I like about dust is that when usually we have the image of God, we do think of like the entity that's up there that's just bigger and bigger and stronger and smarter than the rest of us as well. And that, that has some value, that anthropomorphizing has some value, right? But it's pretty limited when you grow up. And so one of the things that dust does is it helps you to sort of get rid of that image that seems to sometimes cloud what really sort of is God. And so the Gospel of John and John's sort of epistles like speak about God is love. And I always sort of go to that line to that. So it's like, God loves you, but like, this is a different kind of statement. God itself is love. Like, if you've ever experienced love, if you've ever experienced love, you've experienced God. That's really what sort of John's claiming. And partial, incomplete, but like, if you love your dog, if you love chocolate, if you love your spouse or your friend, like if it's a genuine experience of love, like that's a little glimpse of God. And that can help you get over the old guy in the sky kind of image. Again, if that's helpful, that's fine, but just you don't want to make that image what God is itself. And so when you start to think about God as love, is that those moments of connection sort of between people. That's how I start to think about sort of dust, is this kind of this bond that sort of holds the universe together and moves it in sort of certain directions towards what's good. And so it helps, I think, to sorry about that.
Okay.
They're dumping a bunch of rocks next door. But it helps us then to think not just God as like the biggest, baddest person around, with lots of muscles or things, but really helps us to try to imagine what love itself would be, or goodness itself would be, rather than just sort of another sort of person. So I try to think of dust like that kind of like connective tissue, but almost like a current of the universe, or that sort of moves us in sort of certain kinds of ways. So that's my theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's curious to me how it is personal in some sense. It attaches to individuals. It's interested in adults more than children. It's interested in things made by people, all this and that. But it is also sort of beyond any one person. It seems like once you take that metaphor of the ghosts kind of dispersing further, then it's like you are sort of part of everything. Whatever was part of you is now involved in all sorts of other processes and things. So there's a kind of classic, theological problem there about like the nature of the soul and the prime mover. Like, are they of the same sort of thing? Are they distinct? That kind of thing is going on. There's another, classic paradox of free will and determinism, and that, there's a lot of talk about destiny in these books, which seems to kind of, and fate, and that seems to sort of deal with that question in interesting ways. It strikes me that Pullman doesn't seem interested in really answering these problems or questions. He just wants to kind of explore them with this new lens, I guess. And I'm curious, what you think his take on that, how it's informed by, or how it's different from more sort of classically theological answers to those kinds of questions. What does his approach sort of teach us or highlight for us about some of those great, big paradoxes or quibbles?
Yeah, it is interesting. He's very my sense is, I'm a good academic. I always want to qualify things. My sense is that like he's pretty wary of like a world beyond the physical. So like that soul piece, like he wants to embed it in this world and make it sort of material. And I think that's why that appeal of like dust and dark matter helps to him at least to think about that world, or the soul, or what we might call the soul, is something that's just sort of part of our sort of world. So I see him in that sense, like sort of closer to Aristotle than Plato, with the Plato has the eternal forms that are reflected down in sort of the world, but much more sort of closer to sort of Aristotle, that the forms are sort of part of our world that's sort of here. So I see him, that's eternal soul is, I think for him, much more material, and how it starts to, it might coalesce around a person, but then it also, my coalesce around a person, but then it also sort of dissipates at the end and returns down to sort of other people. So there's this sort of overarching sort of connection that you have sort of to everybody that's there. So I think he wants to, like, he realizes there's something more to life than just like the physical world, but he's trying to find a way to sort of embed it in the physical world. So that's it. It is interesting about like the destiny and fate kinds of things. Like he definitely plays around with that a lot in the trilogy, because on the one hand, like Lyra seems to be gifted and fated and has this prophecy surrounding her from the very sort of beginning, and she lives up to it and fulfills it. But then she also and then she has like the rest of her life that she does other things. So it is like, and it's hard to know if this is like a calling, like in the idea of like her, like, is she destined to this free will, or is this something that's calling her up and sort of, like the direction that dust is sort of moving her in, and because she's a good person, she starts to sort of go around and cooperating with it. I don't know if he has a good sort of answer for that, and that might go back to your earlier observation about his sense of authority, which is he doesn't want tyranny, but he also has an authoritative kind of voice, and so he doesn't want people to have their freedom taken away in fate. But there's also kind of clear direction about what you should be doing and what you shouldn't sort of be doing. And I feel like that's the kind of a balance he's trying to sort of negotiate on that. And I don't know if he's got a good kind of resolution to that either.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you said. It's like within the framework of the story, we have to get to a certain end point, but then the characters themselves live on beyond that. And we get to sort of imagine what their stories might be. And it's pretty clear, what their intentions for themselves are going to be to lead these good lives, these full lives, helping others, right? And it's interesting to me that he has chosen to go back and tell some of those stories now, and we get like a prequel of sorts, and we get a little tiny glimpse of like an interlude towards a sequel also. We get like a little bit about Lee Scoresby's early life in one of his little books, and we get something about what Lyra does after she's back in her world in another little book. And now he's got that longer prequel about Lyra as a baby in the Book of Dust. Are you reading those later sequels and prequels and things?
They are totally on my list, and I just haven't gotten to them. I just finished. What did I just? I just read. There's a book called Exit West, which is about these Syrian immigrants, but these portals open up that send you around the world, and so all these people are immigrating around the world, and what it does to sort of borders. I was just finishing the Expanse series, and then I read N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth series, which is just pretty amazing. So they're like on my reading list. I just haven't gotten to them yet. Yeah, but that's, I guess I'm sort of holding it out because is it Amazon? Who's doing the new series on Pullman? Is it Amazon? Yeah, so I was sort of waiting to sort of see when that sort of hits up, and I was going to watch it and then maybe read it.
Yeah, it's I think it's BBC and HBO that's producing or releasing or whatever. So it's going to be. I mean, if you watched any Game of Thrones, they were promoting it pretty heavily, like right after the end credits of that show. So I mean, it could be kind of a new level of interest that'll come up. But as you mentioned, I mean, a lot of your students have already read Pullman, right? They come in to. Do you find that people get more interested in theology as a result of reading Pullman? That's been my personal experience. Yeah. I don't know if that's something students would share with you. And what are their takes on it when you do teach it in class? How do people?
It's just like his world is so imaginative that it just opens up all of these like possibilities of them sort of thinking. Like the idea of the daemon, like, is it a soul? Is it on the outside of your body? Is it take animal form? Like, and suddenly you start to think about the human person and the reflection in the world around you. Like the subtle knife, like the movement between worlds and the different sort of reality and a multiverse or alternative realities. Like it just sort of opens up. And then when he starts going like the different, like the world of angels, but all the way down to, I'm blanking on the name, the spies. Yeah. And so you get all of these, and the witches and the gypsies and the bears. So he's got all these like little mini worlds around him. So they start to like, it's like sparking a sense of imagination. And I always tell them, like, this is perfect. Like the idea of religion, the root word, one theory of it, and the theory I tell them, which is like, it comes from the word ligament, and religion is about what holds things together. And so as you start digging in what holds these worlds together, they, then that sparks them to think about religion and Christianity in sort of other kind of ways. Like half the time they don't really, they, like the anti-Christian or anti-Lewis stuff, they don't ever pick up on. They're like, oh yeah, authority's bad, and you know, you shouldn't be mean to people. And then I'm like, there's some other stuff going on. They're like, really? So they're much more interested in the positive sort of characters. So it is definitely, they like, it's just exciting for them. And so that sparks their imagination. That opens up all sorts of conversations you can sort of have.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it. I would really love to get to teach this stuff someday in some form. So I'm glad to hear that you're out there doing it and that it's going well.
I'll give you one word of encouragement to do that, is that the one of the fallouts of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that more and more students are interested in these kinds of questions. And I have other courses that used to be way more popular, and this one was like a little niche course that a few students taught. And now it's like, tons of students are looking into this courses because they want to think about these things a little bit more. So go teach that course.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. And it's been really interesting getting to pick your brain about some of this stuff. Again, I'd recommend the book, Killing the Imposter God, by Jason King, Donna Freitas. Yep. Is there anything in particular you're working on right now with respect to this stuff, or your scholarly interests taking you down other paths these days?
The closest, I'm working on a book about Mr. Rogers and his environmentalism. He had a whole week on environmentalism in 1990, and it's this trash apocalypse where the neighborhood of make-believe is being overrun by trash, and all the surrounding cities are overrun by trash, and he's got all of these kind of so he blends like fantasy and real world kind of pieces. And so I've been playing around with that with a friend of mine. Her name's Sarah Lindy, in the English department. So that's been a lot of fun, and it's definitely like preschool age, so it's a little bit of a different one. But yeah, that's a blast. Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, it'll certainly prepare people well to think about dust and questions of pantheism down the road someday. Right?
All right.
All right. Well,
thanks so much for the invitation.
Yes. Appreciate it.